Hi. So in this video, I want to talk about the dunder string and dunder repr methods. So sometimes that's a point of confusion for people. They wonder like, well, which one should I use and what's the difference? So let's take a look at that. So both are basically methods that you can create on your class, which is used to generate the string representation of an instance. So both of these should return a string, and both of these are supposed to be representations of that object. So why have two of them? Well, typically the dunder repr method is used by developers. So we use that as we're developing our code to basically provide some additional information about the object itself. Very often we try and make the representation such that it can be used to recreate the object. So the way that you would instantiate that object, that instance, right? You would call the class, you would pass in arguments. We try and put that into the output of the repr method as a string, so it looks and tells you kind of how this object was created in the first place. Now, sometimes it's difficult to do. Maybe you have too many arguments to pass in, or maybe it's a variable number of arguments that just gets too large. So then you just try and make that representation as descriptive as possible in terms of whatever suits you as a developer, or as a developer using your class, something that will help them understand what that object is, how it was created, and so on. And it's called when we use the repr function. So Python has a function, a built-in function called repr. When you call repr on an instance of one of your classes, it will look for the dunder repr method, call that. Okay? Now the dunder string is used by the other functions like string and print. So both of these are actually going to use, when you're trying to print your object or convert your object to a string, it's actually going to look for and call the dunder string method. So it also returns a string. It's also supposed to be the representation of the object. But it's typically used more for display purposes. For example, to end users. You might want to display something about that particular object to the end user, but they don't need all the information that would come back from the repr. They need something that's maybe a little more simplified. Or maybe it's for logging and you want to use kind of a more simple representation of your object when you're logging and so on. So it's really just two different flavors of the same thing. It's the representation, a string representation of an object, but repr is more for internal use, debugging, development, and so on. Now, the way it works is that if the dunder string method is not implemented in your class, then Python will look for the repr method instead. So if you call string or print on an object, it will first look for the string method, the dunder string method. If it doesn't find it, it will then look for the dunder repr method and use that instead. Now, sometimes we don't implement either of those. So we'll come back to this in the context of inheritance, but in Python, every object actually inherits from kind of a parent, a grandparent object. And that has a default implementation for the repr method, so that method will be used. And that one is the one that basically returns what we've seen so often in this course, things like the object ID, right, where it's located, so the class name and the memory location of where that object starts. That actually comes from this object class that basically every other object or every other class in Python inherits from. But we'll come back to this in the context of inheritance. All right, so let's switch to some code and let's take a look at how that works. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a bit.